Chapter 17: Why Systems Collapse from the Inside. Systems rarely collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because internal structures no longer support the load placed upon them. External pressure may trigger visible failure, but the conditions for collapse are created internally, over time, and often with good intentions. This chapter examines why collapse is almost always an inside job. External pressure as trigger, not cause. External forces are visible. Market shifts, political pressure, technological disruption, social change, these are easy to point to. They provide clean explanations and absolve internal actors from responsibility. They are rarely the cause. External pressure exposes weakness. It does not create it. Systems that are internally coherent absorb pressure. Systems that are misaligned fracture under it. Pressure reveals structure. The myth of external blame. Blaming external factors feels rational. It preserves identity. It protects legitimacy. It frames collapse as misfortune rather than misconfiguration. This framing is comforting. It is also corrosive. External blame prevents internal examination. It delays learning. It guarantees repetition. Systems that blame externally rebuild the same structures and encounter the same outcomes. Internal drift as primary failure mode. Internal drift is subtle. It occurs when small misalignments are tolerated repeatedly. When boundaries soften incrementally. When responsibility shifts quietly. When exceptions accumulate. No single decision appears catastrophic. Together, they alter the system's internal geometry. Drift is rarely noticed until correction becomes unavoidable. How systems normalize internal degradation. Degradation becomes normal through adaptation. Systems adjust expectations downward. They redefine success. They recalibrate standards to match declining coherence. This adaptation feels pragmatic. It is dangerous. Normalization hides loss. It reframes deterioration as reality rather than warning. Responsibility erosion. Internal collapse accelerates when responsibility erodes. Decision makers become insulated from consequence. Accountability diffuses across layers. Outcomes are owned abstractly rather than structurally. When responsibility erodes, feedback weakens. Systems lose the ability to learn from their own actions. Internal incentives against correction. Many systems develop incentives that reward misalignment. Speed is rewarded over accuracy. Loyalty over truth. Compliance over coherence. Output over integrity. These incentives discourage examination. Correction becomes costly. Silence becomes profitable. The system optimizes against its own stability. The collapse of internal trust. Trust collapses before systems do. People stop assuming good faith. Coordination becomes defensive. Communication becomes guarded. This loss of trust increases transaction cost internally. Control replaces cooperation. Oversight replaces judgment. The system becomes heavy. When internal signals are treated as threats. Internal critique is often reframed as disruption. Those who point out misalignment are labeled negative, resistant, or disloyal. Their observations are treated as personal rather than structural. This response silences internal signals. The system blinds itself. When this is ignored. When internal signals are ignored, systems rely on external enforcement to correct configuration. Correction becomes forceful rather than adaptive. Learning becomes painful rather than incremental. The system experiences collapse as invasion. Complexity as cover for internal failure. Complexity hides responsibility. As systems grow, causal chains lengthen. Outcomes appear distant from decisions. Accountability becomes abstract. This opacity allows internal failure to persist unnoticed. Complex systems do not collapse because they are complex. They collapse because complexity masks misalignment. The internal cost of maintaining appearances. Maintaining appearance requires effort. Narratives must be reinforced. Metrics curated. Dissent managed. confidence projected. This effort drains capacity. Energy spent on appearance cannot be spent on correction. The system becomes exhausted by its own performance. Internal collapse precedes external shock. By the time external shock arrives, internal collapse is already advanced. Capacity is reduced. Trust is thin. Feedback is weak. Responsibility is unclear. The shock simply overwhelms what remains. Observers attribute collapse to the shock. The system collapsed earlier. Why internal collapse feels invisible? Internal collapse is invisible because it lacks drama. No single event marks its beginning. No clear threshold is crossed. No alarm sounds. Collapse feels like continuity until it doesn't. Visibility arrives late. The role of identity protection. Systems protect identity aggressively. Admitting internal failure threatens legitimacy. Questioning structure feels like betrayal. Identity protection overrides examination. Structure is sacrificed to preserve self-image. Internal collapse and the loss of sovereignty. Sovereignty, personal, organizational, or institutional, depends on internal control. When internal coherence is lost, external forces dictate outcomes. Decisions are made reactively. Options narrow. Loss of sovereignty is gradual. External enforcement is the final stage. Why reforms fail after collapse. Post-collapse reforms often fail because they focus on surface structures. Leadership changes. Rules are rewritten. Systems are rebranded. Internal geometry remains unchanged. Without examining responsibility alignment, feedback pathways, and capacity limits, reforms reproduce collapse. Internal collapse across scales. At the individual level, internal collapse appears as burnout, confusion, or loss of agency. At the organizational level, it appears as bureaucracy, inertia, and declining innovation. At the institutional level, it appears as legitimacy erosion and increased coercion. The pattern is invariant. The timing problem of internal collapse. Internal collapse unfolds slowly. Correction requires early action. Recognition often arrives late. By the time collapse is acknowledged, the system's capacity to respond has already diminished. Timing determines severity. Why systems resist internal diagnosis. Internal diagnosis is destabilizing. It requires admitting past error. It threatens authority. It disrupts narrative continuity. Resistance is rational. It is also fatal. Systems that cannot examine themselves cannot survive complexity. Internal collapse is not moral failure. Internal collapse is not evidence of bad people or evil intent. It is evidence of misaligned structure. Moralizing collapse prevents learning. Structural analysis enables renewal. Closing constitutional statement. Systems do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because they lose internal coherence and can no longer absorb pressure. External forces expose failure. Internal misalignment creates it. Collapse from the inside is not dramatic. It is gradual, quiet, and preventable until it is not. End of chapter 17.